few failed attempts, I decided last minute to head out solo to kayak and hike Lake Powell to Antelope Canyon in Page, Arizona. And I'm so glad I did because it ended up being one of my fave trips. I stopped by Walmart to pick up a 0-degree sleeping bag and a new paddle because I realized I forgot my paddle. I arrived at the Antelope Point launch ramp at about 1:30 a.m. and the parking lot had no lights and there was only one creepy white van. So I decided to drive back to a well-lit Shell gas station I passed on the way. I slept in my kayak in the back of my little Nissan Murano and it wasn't all that bad. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and at 5 a.m. and when I open, I wake up to a man to my right selling something to another man in a truck. My first thought was that I was in the middle of a drug deal. I was surrounded on both sides by Indians. I looked to my left and there's a man and a woman and I could see the back of a cardboard sign in their windshield and I thought surely they wouldn't be advertising drugs. So I rolled down my window and I asked what they were selling. The woman let me know that they were selling Spam, bacon, and potato breakfast burritos on homemade tortillas. I had no idea this parking lot served breakfast, so I was pretty excited. I, of course, bought one and zelled Mrs. Yellowman. We just chatted about being grandparents and all that I had to look forward to having my first grandbaby due this August. She let me know the gas station about a mile away was already open and serving coffee. So I headed down there and I used the restroom to brush my teeth, clean myself up, and drench myself in sunblock. To take this adventure, you will need an America the Beautiful pass, or you can pay the $30 for a one-time entry fee. Once you show your pass, do not go to the first boat ramp on the right. You're going to keep driving straight to the next boat ramp. There is parking on this ramp, and I have a detachable wheels on my kayak, and wasn't that difficult to get the kayak down the hill, and it navigated pretty easily over the large rocks and through the sand. I then flipped the wheels the opposite direction and bungee them to my kayak, along with my dry bag that's full of water, snacks, and of course, more sunblock. You're going to want to push the kayak into the water a little off of the rocks, and then you're going to sit your bum in it first and then swing your legs over into it. It is the easiest way to get into a sit-on kayak, and it is different than a sit-in kayak. The kayaking tours begin at 8 a.m. and I highly recommend you go on the water before them. I helped a few people push off that were having trouble. When you launch from the boat ramp, just go left. You paddle 1 mile to the first opening and make a left. You continue paddling all the way to the end. There's literally only one way to go, so you can't get lost. I was able to paddle past the tour of about 7 people, so I could enter the canyon first. My goal was to experience the glass water I had read about. The water is about 64 degrees on average in May per Google. It really wasn't that bad, especially because it was pretty hot during the day. The water is very clear and you can see the beautiful rock formations and large fish as you paddle close to the shore. Hundreds of lizards were, just running up the sides of the walls, and the birds allowed you to get pretty close. As you first enter the canyon in your kayak, the rocks are a more whitewashed, faded color. And then as you paddle further down the canyon, the walls become more red and vibrant. The glass water was perfection. While I'm paddling in the video, I'll just take this time to, give you some heads up about some things when you're heading out for trips, just in case you're new to this. Basically, number one is to always check not only the weather. You never, ever want to hike a canyon if there's going to be any kind of rain, because you will have the chance of a flash flood, which is highly dangerous. Do not ever hike a canyon if it is raining. lots of people have lost their lives that way. The second is, wind. If it's going to be a windy day, it's going to be very difficult for you to paddle. So some of the things to remember is that pretty much every lake in the afternoon seems to be windier. So the earlier you get out, the earlier you get back, you're going to avoid that. And also the more watercraft that are on the water, it's going to create more waves. The experience that I had on this lake was not so much like white-capped waves that I've experienced, say, Lake Mead in Nevada. But it was more like my friend that I met there described it as a washer machine. So it was a little difficult to get through those waves. right shoulder, 2 ducks scared the heck out of me, diving into the water in front of me, and they then took the lead and they kept me company on my paddle. run right into the beach. This is where you leave your kayak or paddleboard. Here we go. This is where we begin the hike into Antelope Canyon. This cool little lizard gave me a push-up show. Canyon walls are gorgeous and grand. One ladder along this trail to assist you in your climb. Watch out for rattlesnakes. I did see this baby one and he shook his little rattle at me. The next day, a ranger identified it for me as a Hopi rattlesnake. Depending on when you visit, there may be pools of water. I was lucky enough to see them hiking in May. I was a little nervous to continue the hike to the end alone, knowing that I was the only one that deep in the canyon. So when I saw the only man ahead of me headed back out, I stopped him and asked if he would hike it with me. Duran was so nice and agreed. You're going to come to a fork in the canyon. We chose to go right, and I'm so glad that we did because we were able to see this amazing ending, which I had seen online, and we did a funny little jump for a picture. This adorable lizard caught a moth, and we got it on camera. I'm so glad we hiked the entire way. It was definitely worth it. Now, pulling my kayak out was not as easy. It was difficult to hold my footing with the weight and the loose sand. So my strategy was to find the bigger rocks so that I could get better footing. And then I was able to kind of crawl my way up the hill. At least 6 guys asked to assist me, but I declined because I was determined to do it by myself, especially because I've been going on these solo trips. The views are breathtaking around the lake. I completed the trip and now I'm headed to Horseshoe Bend.